Welcome back to In-Depth Literature. Make sure you guys follow me on Substack at In-Depth Literature, and please follow me on Instagram at Andrew Marlowe Artist Official. Please follow the playlist and follow this channel. Please like and share this video. It really helps me out in the algorithm. So today we are here for some more Thomas Wolfe content. I know some of you Thomas Wolfe enthusiasts have been eagerly awaiting my next Thomas Wolfe episode. Today we are going to be covering the posthumous work known as You Can't Go Home Again. Now, sometimes this book is critiqued because it is it was posthumously edited and published by Edward Aswell. Thomas Wolfe had actually split with Maxwell Perkins at the time of his death in 1938. His very untimely, way too soon death, I might add. And this is my second reread of You Can't Go Home Again. So we're actually going to go through the entire text. So if you haven't read this and you don't want to hear spoilers, maybe just skip this video, come back to it later on. But also, if you're interested in Thomas Wolfe and you haven't really read his posthumous works, or you haven't read You Can't Go Home Again, I will encourage you to read it. And I don't think that any of the spoilers, Thomas Wolfe doesn't really write the type of novels that call for not giving away spoilers, because his plots or his novels, I should say, are not really plot driven. They're more character driven. So there's not really any super juicy, complex esoteric endings or anything like that you have to worry about not wanting to know about beforehand. Thomas Wolfe is an autobiographical author. He writes about America, he writes about his family heritage, and he writes about the creative process. But I do want to sort of give this sort of an annotated take, kind of take you through the structure of the novel thematically, chapter-wise, and sort of emotionally and spiritually, and we can sort of see and understand how Thomas Wolfe got to point A to point B in terms of You Can't Go Home Again. Now, the first time I read You Can't Go Home Again, I was a little underwhelmed. The second reading was definitely much better. I think each time you read Thomas Wolfe, you become more immersed, you become much more of a fan of Thomas Wolfe, and that's the great thing about Thomas Wolfe, is that he takes a lifetime to really understand. Obviously, when you first read Look Homeward Angel or Of Time in the River, obviously it's enjoyable, you're pretty enthralled, you're impressed with the language, but to really understand Thomas Wolfe's literary legacy, it really takes multiple readings. Another interesting thing about Thomas Wolfe's posthumous works, that being You Can't Go Home Again and The Web and the Rock, Among the Hills Beyond, is that he features a different protagonist in these later novels, that being the original, obviously, with his first two novels was Eugene Gant, and then with his posthumous works, Web and the Rock and You Can't Go Home Again, he shifts to George Webber, and he has a different family heritage. There's a different sort of characterization, similar character arc, and sort of similar family history. George Webber happens to be an orphan, slightly different than Eugene Gant and the Gant family. I don't think that the Gant, or I should say, I don't think the Webber family is quite as compelling, is quite as interesting. But we do meet some of the Joiners and the Webbers throughout the pages of his posthumous works. And like I said, a lot of people criticize his posthumous works because they were so heavily published and edited by the creation, or the vision, I should say, of Edward Aswell. And some people believe that Edward Aswell sort of went a little too far, went above and beyond, and sort of over-edited and sort of overreached his authority as an editor. But Thomas Wolfe was dead. You have to remember that. I think, Edward Aswell had permission from the Thomas Wolfe estate, as well as Maxwell Perkins, to, pretty much, edit it, at least, creatively speaking. He was allowed to go to town as far as, sort of repackaging Thomas Wolfe's vision or his style. There are some parts in his posthumous works, namely sort of these, and I'll show you an example. So in the later sections of You Can't Go Home Again, as well as The Web and the Rock, I think features these, you will see these sort of italicized intros. I don't want to push it too close to the screen, but these are, rumored to be sort of packaged and edited and created by Edward Aswell to sort of further contextualize or sort of, make more sense of Thomas Wolfe's sort of scattered autobiographical narrative. And I think they are helpful. And, they do sort of take the rough ideas, the root of Thomas Wolfe's creative visions or his creative motifs, motives, however you might put that, and he sort of repackages it sort of as little introductory sections to sort of further the narrative. So it doesn't really hurt the novel. It doesn't really hurt the structure of You Can't Go Home Again. But people believe that the reason why his posthumous works are maybe sometimes more readable or more successful is because of Edward as well. But even going previously back to Look Homeward Angel and Of Time in the River, Thomas Wolfe always collaborated with an editor, as every author does. So I'm not really sure why Thomas Wolfe is sort of, put down because he was reliant on an editor. I mean, even Stephen King has an editor. Cormac McCarthy had an editor. I'm not sure if Dostoevsky had an editor, but Tolstoy, his wife was like his editor and sort of his publicist. So every author works with an editor to some degree. So for people to sort of scoff at Thomas Wolfe collaborating with, his editors, just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. So let's get into the pages of You Can't Go Home Again. Now, this tells the tale of George Weber, becoming a successful author. It tells of Esther Jack, which is sort of the fictional pseudo sit-in for Elaine Bernstein. And it talks of his travels to Europe. And there's definitely this beautiful metamorphosis, this transformation, if you will, that takes place that brings George Weber out into the larger universe of society and of the world and of culture, both in the United States and particularly Germany and London and these other places that he inhabits. He ends up hanging out with Sinclair Lewis, in fact, and he goes on this strange sort of esoteric midnight drive around the rainy streets of London with Sinclair Lewis, and Sinclair Lewis is like falling ill and he's sort of in and out of this weird comatose state. And we have sort of the tensions with Esther Jack, that being Elaine Bernstein. We have racial explorations, racial tensions that come up, both of the American, white and black societies, but also of the burgeoning Third Reich that is, sort of taking over various parts of Europe at the time of Thomas Wolfe's travels. And by the end of it, we sort of get this beautiful transformation of, a man sort of coming to terms with the fact that, no, he can't go home again, not only physically because things have changed, but also on an emotional, mental, and spiritual level, that we can never go back to those early times of our youth. We can never overcome the tragedies of a society. We can never overcome completely the way that sort of society shifts like a tectonic plate, and once a certain traumatic event happens, there really is no way back. It's up to sort of the following generations to sort of keep that flame of hope going for society, both in America and as well as Europe. And Thomas Wolfe is disillusioned completely by humanity, but he still had this beautiful hope for humanity's rebirth, so to speak. So we're going to start in the beginning of the novel. I got all my annotations here. Grab a cup of tea, grab some coffee, a glass of wine, a nice meal, whatever it is you might enjoy, and please, join us for this beautiful exploration of the You Can't Go Home Again by Thomas Wolfe. This particular version does have a really good in-depth analysis written by Gail Godwin in the beginning. I would suggest you read it. But the beginning of You Can't Go Home Again, he is in New York. He's not really a struggling writer like he was in previous novels. He's a pretty successful writer. And my first annotation is basically Weber acknowledges the shortcomings of his emotions, that sometimes they get the best of him. And I actually wrote note to self, because we get this image that George Weber is sort of this temperamental, overly sensitive, sometimes immature, but very heartfelt, giving, loving person, this up-and-coming successful writer, but he gets entangled with his various other people that are in his life. He has trouble controlling his emotions, but that all comes out in his writing. What he lacks in social skills or familial relationships, familial social skills, relationship-wise, he puts that into his writing. He's able to explore the beautiful complexities of relationships in his characters, and we get these reflections on the creative process the reflections on what it's like to be published, and he sneaks around New York, at the debut of his first or second published novel, and he kind of keeps walking by the bookstore because he's so enamored. He sees his own book in the window, and he's, feels that everybody is kind of suspiciously looking at him, and very almost Eugene Gant, this sort of neurosis that takes place with George Weber. And also, before I get too ahead of myself, I did want to sort of mention the relationship that is explored between Thomas Wolfe and Maxwell Perkins in the novel. Maxwell Perkins is named Foxhall Edwards, so that is another beautiful relationship that takes place in the pages of You Can't Go Home Again. Second annotation here again says Maxwell Perkins, the writing process, and Wolfe's odd behavior, because Wolfe, or George Weber does have a lot of neurotic tendencies. He stays up late all night drinking and writing, and then he walks the streets of Brooklyn, and he gets a lot of emotional sources of his energy from the sprawling concrete jungle, as he refers to New York City, and he sees the vast array of successful people, struggling people, impoverished people, the various different races, the various different cultures, the burgeoning construction, the high-rise apartments and the sky-rise, or the skyscrapers, I should say, and sort of this beast of economy and this beast creature of entrepreneurship that later came to be in New York City. Thomas Wolfe was kind of in the early stages of that, or maybe the mid stages, and he sees the complexities and he sees the struggles between the different clashes of cultures and races, and how economics affect sort of in this trickle-down way every single person that lives in this concrete jungle. And we get sort of Thomas Wolfe's neurosis, but also sort of the neurotic way that he studies and sort of gains inspiration from the other characters. My third annotation is this really interesting, funny character called Mr. Komoto, Japanese man that lives above him, or actually below him, and when he encounters this quirky sort of Japanese character, Mr. Komodo says, "I heard you trampling last night, trampling." And when we first read that text, there's like this whole 3 or 4 pages of Mr. Komodo complaining about George Weber trampling, and we can't quite figure out what he's talking about. But then it turns out that because Mr. Komodo lives below Thomas Wolfe, the giant, 6'5" Thomas Wolfe, George Weber is actually described as being kind of short and with long arms and sort of this more stout sort of character versus the really tall Thomas Wolfe. But it's funny because when Thomas Wolfe attempts to describe George Weber, pretty much all we can think of is sort of Thomas Wolfe. It's kind of ironic how that works, but it's fascinating. But it turns out that Thomas Wolfe is working all night, and he's walking around pacing, and he's writing all night. And he's scattering his manuscripts all over the apartment. And that is what the trampling is that Mr. Komodo is complaining about. And it kind of reminds me of the other Asian, I think he's a Japanese character that occurs in Of Time in the River. And I think Mr. Zen, I think his name might have been, I can't quite remember. But he has this really funny, sort of quirky, hilarious comedic relationship with that character in Of Time in the River, and we kind of see that recreated again with Mr. Komodo. And then it turns out that he ends up making pretty good friends with Mr. Komodo, and Mr. Komodo ends up taking ill and passes away, and Thomas Wolfe is disturbed by sort of the briefness of our days that he loves to talk about. And then we get, I think Thomas Wolfe goes back home for a brief period, or he encounters one of his old friends from maybe the days of The Web and the Rock, from his upbringing. George Weber, kind of his origins are of an orphan, and he was adopted by the Joiners. And we get this kind of quirky, interesting character called Nebraska Crane, and he's obsessed with baseball. And then on this train ride, he encounters this corrupt judge named Judge Bland, who exploits the local Negroes. And this man is from George Weber's hometown and Nebraska Crane's hometown. And we get this beautiful exploration of racial tensions, and maybe for the first time since The Child by Tiger and The Web and the Rock, we get this, as far as we can get from Thomas Wolfe, this honest exploration of the racial tensions and the plight that the African Americans often suffered in the Old South of America, and we get this corrupt, evil judge named Judge Bland, who sort of runs this local shop where he gets poor, impoverished Negroes to come in and trade their valuables, their furniture, and he is well aware that they will never be able to pay any of these debts off, but he continues to accumulate this junk, and his patrons are just amounting all of this outrageous interest that they can never pay back. This is one of my most highlighted sections. I actually featured it on my Instagram because it really is so profound. Maybe we could just read a little excerpt here. How did Judge Rumford Bland not come into collision with the law? Did the police not know from what sources and in what ways his income was derived? They knew perfectly. The very store in which this miserable business was carried on was in 20 yards of the city hall and within 50 feet of the side entrance of the town calaboose, up whose stone steps many of the same Negroes had time and again been hauled and mauled and hurled into a cell. The practice, criminal though it was a common one, winked at by the local authorities, and but one of many similar practices by which unscrupulous white men all over the South feathered their own nest at the expense of an oppressed and ignorant people. Just very blunt and very beautifully and very realistically said. Now, obviously, this is not the plight of every single African American, but Thomas Wolfe is willing to, discuss this. I think it's wonderful. It's a huge turnaround from the days of Time in the River and even Look Homeward Angel, which is quite controversial in sort of the way that the black characters are sort of depicted or not depicted. So skipping a little bit ahead here, we get this beautiful exploration of the Joyner family history. And Thomas Wolfe, one of his relatives, has taken ill and passed on to the next world, and George Webber travels back to his hometown. I forgot where it is exactly, somewhere in the Midwest or the South, I believe. But we get this beautiful exploration of his relationship with Aunt Ma and the Joyners and, George Webber's grandfather, Uncle Mark. And we sort of get briefly it's sort of a pseudo Gant-esque sort of family dynamic, but it's not quite as neurotic. The characters are not quite as impactful, but I think Aunt Ma, some of the Joyners sort of loosely resemble Eliza Gant briefly. It's interesting how Thomas Wolfe was able to break free of the Gant family, and I tend to, let me know in the comment section what you ladies and gentlemen think, but I tend to really prefer the Gant family. I think Eugene Gant is a little bit stronger of a protagonist in terms of his family heritage, but he doesn't grow up and sort of metamorphosize he doesn't have the same impact, or I should say his metamorphosis doesn't have the same powerful impact as George Webber's does. So I think in some ways George Webber is a much stronger, more diverse protagonist, if you will, but there's something about the family dynamics of the Gant family and Eugene Gant that I almost prefer. But having said that, I enjoy Thomas Wolfe's posthumous George Webber universe a little bit more. It's a little more rich. It's a little more diverse. It's a little more mature than his earlier two outputs with Of Time in the River and Look Homeward Angel or Oh Lost. Now, I will say that, we'll talk about that later. I actually covered Oh Lost in a previous episode. We've done a whole exploration of Oh Lost, as well as Of Time in the River, as well as of Web in the Rock, as well as a bunch of other Thomas Wolfe stuff. So I will make sure I share the Thomas Wolfe playlist with you all below. And we have this beautiful sort of cryptic, esoteric exploration of the funeral procession that takes place among the Joyners. And Thomas Wolfe is looking at the graveyard, and he's looking at his old hometown where he grew up, and he's sort of reflecting on the passage of time, as Thomas Wolfe does here. And we've got this beautiful passage here describing the funeral procession. Slowly the coffin was lowered in its grave, and as the black lid disappeared from sight, George felt such a stab of wordless pain and grief as he had ever known. But he knew even as he felt it that it wasn't sorrow for Aunt Ma. It was an aching pity for himself and for all men living, and it was the knowledge of the briefness of man's days and the smallness of his life, and the certain dark that comes too swiftly and that has no end. And I think we've all suffered that esoteric existential crisis at a funeral, or maybe even at a baptism, a wedding, a birth, a family tragedy, a court case, whatever the case is. We see the briefness of man's time here on earth, and it really is heartbreaking. And Thomas Wolfe is one of the few writers that can really put that so perfectly into the English language. So skipping ahead a little bit here, we have Amelia Weber / Joyner was George's mother. So we do get, like I said, I think Amelia was George Weber's mother, and she's sort of similar to Eliza Gant. She is focused on real estate. She's a little neurotic, but it's not quite the same relationship. It's not quite as maybe Freudian, or there's not as much tension. You know, the Eugene Gant relationship with Eliza Gant, there's a lot of sort of Freudian frustrations and tensions boiling underneath the surface, if you will. But I think the relationship between the Joyner family members is a little bit more positive. It's a little bit more uplifting. So skipping ahead to sort of the 25% mark of the novel, and again, we have another annotated intro on book 2, The World That Jack Built. And this is in reference to George Weber's relationship with Esther Jack, and he goes on these long monologues from the perspective of Aline Bernstein. I always struggle to pronounce that. Is it Aline or Aileen? And I'm pretty sure it's Bernstein, not Bernstein, because it's E-I-N, I think. That would be Bernstein, not Bernstein, right? I don't know, I could be wrong. Chapter 10 features, and this is kind of interesting considering the fact that George Weber, aka Thomas Wolfe, was having an affair with Elaine Bernstein. He actually writes a few chapters from the perspective of Elaine Bernstein's husband, or Esther Jack's husband. That whole section is called Jack in the Morning, Jack at Morn. It's called The House That Jack Built Previously. And just these really interesting, sympathetic, empathetic, I should say, beautiful explorations of Elaine Bernstein's husband, which is kind of ironic considering the fact that Thomas Wolfe was having an affair with Elaine Bernstein. He was kind of betraying Elaine Bernstein's husband. I believe she was married at the time. She might have been somewhat separated. They did have some kids. But it's interesting how he offered a little bit of humanity to Elaine Bernstein's husband and sort of that whole affair by portraying Frederick Jack. Just kind of beautiful and brilliant. There's also, interestingly enough, Elaine Bernstein has a house servant named Nora, Esther's house servant, and Thomas Wolfe goes into these beautiful monologues about not only sort of the neurotic characterization of Nora, the housekeeper, but also the way that she relates to Esther Jack's wealth and sort of the power that Esther Jack has over Nora. And Esther Jack has these moments where she gets really embittered and frustrated with her servants, but she has to sort of take a step back, take a deep breath, and have some pity on sort of these sort of old crones that are, employed by her. And she has to sort of, not be so suspicious and not be so demanding of these women that have struggled all their lives, and just these beautiful perceptions of femininity and how it is corrupted by wage slavery or being poor and having to work for the man. Esther and Frederick Jack discuss Esther's theatrical accomplishments. Now, on that note, I do want to share another text with you all. We'll discuss this here. We have covered this as well. This is called The Good Child's River, and this is an entire novella. It's more like a long format novel, but this is an entire book written by Thomas Wolfe, obviously, from the perspective of Esther Jack. So if you're interested in Elaine Bernstein or his relationship with Elaine Bernstein or the history, the life of Elaine Bernstein, this is definitely a hidden gem that most people don't know about. Like I said, we have covered it. And I will say that when Thomas Wolfe writes about Elaine Bernstein, or from the perspective of Elaine Bernstein, to me, it's not his strongest work. He's better when he's writing about his own alter egos, or maybe when he's writing about his family heritage, or the social tensions, or sort of the neurotic aspects of the creative process. But there seems to be something maybe a little bit forced like he was so desperate to, because he was critiqued as only being able to write about himself. And he writes about Esther Jack and Esther Jack's husband. And before we interrupt ourselves, there's a whole section written from the perspective of Foxhall Edwards, aka Maxwell Perkins, that is quite effective. So he is able to, that being Thomas Wolfe, he is able to write outside of himself. He is able to write about other characters. Having said that, it's just not quite as convincing. It seems a little bit contrived, and to me it's just not as interesting. I think Thomas Wolfe really shines when he's writing from the perspective of George Webber or Eugene Gant. So fast forwarding to not quite the halfway point of the novel, Wolfe balances out much more the other characters than previous novels. He branches out much more to other characters, I should say. And The Web and the Rock was sort of Thomas Wolfe's first attempt to break out of the world of Dixieland and the Gant family and W. Oliver Gant and Eliza Gant and Eugene and all that. And he does that quite effectively in The Web and the Rock, but even more so in You Can't Go Home Again, because we get sort of not only the familial history of the Joiners and the Webbers, but we get his relationship with Elaine Bernstein. We get his relationship with New York City, with the publishing process. We get his relationship with Nebraska Crane and Judge Blumford, the corrupt, evil, racist judge. And we get his relationship with Maxwell Perkins, aka Foxhall Edwards. And then further, we get his relationship with more people in Germany that takes place. So we can definitely see Thomas Wolfe kind of breaking out of his shell, if you will, in this fantastic manner. Now, about halfway, not halfway, but on about page 250, Esther Jack's high-rise apartment catches on fire, and all of the people, all the interesting, quirky characters from Esther Jack's apartment are made to find the nearest exit, and they're all sort of descending down the staircase, and they have to walk outside and cross the building at the instruction of the fire department. And we get this wonderful, really fascinating exploration of all the different types of people that live at that apartment, and the way that people sort of come together under a tragedy or under a sort of a fire or some type of maintenance problem, whether it's a flood, a fire, a storm, a tornado, and all of the people of New York are sort of congregating outside of this apartment, and George Webber is sort of interacting with them loosely, but he's more so observing. And Esther Jack is really excited, and there's all these quirky, neurotic mannerisms. So that's a beautiful section of the novel as well. And then his relationship with Esther Jack progresses a little bit, but they are sort of at each other's throats. Their time as sort of as a couple, as a relationship, much like it did in real life, has kind of reached its breaking point, and it's time for George Webber, aka Thomas Wolfe, to further explore the world without being shackled down by Elaine Bernstein, even though that was the greatest love of his life, and vice versa. It is pretty tragic that they were just not able to really work together. Thomas Wolfe, George Webber was becoming increasingly neurotic and sort of morose, and just was aggressive and hung over all the time, and he was struggling to sort of redefine himself not only as an author in America but also as a writer, and what publisher he was going to establish himself with, what editor he was going to collaborate with. And before Thomas Wolfe died, we discussed, rather after Wolfe died, that his last two novels, as well as The Hills Beyond, were published posthumously by Edward Aswell at Harper's, I believe. I think he transferred from Scribner's and then later went to Harper's or something, or I could be wrong about that, but he obviously got to know Edward Aswell towards the last 6 or 7 months of his life, I believe, before he passed away. And he trusted Edward Aswell. So it wasn't that Edward Aswell, stole all of Wolfe's material and republished it and sort of over-edited it. He did have sort of a brief, a pretty strong, if sadly brief, relationship with Wolfe, and he had Wolfe's blessing, I believe, on the way that things were going to sort of, I mean, Wolfe knew that his works were going to be drastically transformed by his editors at Harper's or with Edward as well. So George confronts his impending feelings of doom and breaks with Esther. So we just mentioned sort of the break between, and that's another part of sort of the whole philosophy of you can't go home again, is that you can't go back to the way your relationship once was. You can't go back to the city before it became a giant sprawling metropolis. You can't go back to the early days of your creativity. You can't go back to your school days. You can't go back to naivety and to the America, the world that you once knew. And, you know, as a young person kind of reaching my, not quite middle age, but I'm going to be turning 36 this month. Happy birthday to me. Leave me a happy birthday thing in the comment section. I'm just kidding, you don't have to. But, you know, I relate to this narrative quite a bit. And Harold Bloom infamously states that Thomas Wolfe, you know, his readers, his fans are eternal adolescents. And maybe some ways we are. But this book is not really about the metamorphosis of an adolescent. It's about the transformation of a grown man who is maybe reflecting on his early adolescence, but has matured and has accepted the passage of time. And that's why this book is so popular, and that's why Harold Bloom is a tool. We don't really listen too much to Harold Bloom over here. I know he has some good things about Shakespeare and other writers, but to me, he just says so much, but or he talks so much, but says so little to me. I can't, you know, he talks in all these sort of overly complex phrases and words, and yeah, Harold Bloom, not really a big fan of him. I know a lot of people are. If there's a good book to read by Harold Bloom, please let me know. I do have his critique of Thomas Wolfe's. He actually only wrote like the intro, but he kind of packaged this whole book. Maybe we'll show it to you at the end of Thomas Wolfe critiques. Anyway, Weber's first book and reflections as a writer. And he reflects on sort of the plight of America, which is part of his theme. We'll read a little section here. But it was not only in the South that America was hurt. There was another deeper, darker, and more nameless wound throughout the land. Was it the record of corrupt officials and polluted governments, administrations twisted to the core, the huge excess of privilege and graft, protected criminals and gangster rule, the democratic forms, all rotten and putrescent with disease? Or was it the Puritanism, that great vague name, whatever it may be? Was it the bloated surfights of monopoly and the crimes of wealth against the worker's life? Yes, it was all of these, and in the daily tolling of the murdered men, the lurid renderings of promiscuous and casual slaughter everywhere throughout the land. So I'll keep it short and sweet, but just beautiful explorations of the corruption of America. Thomas Wolfe has always been concerned with the demise and the corruption within society and within local governments and within worldwide governments, and just a beautiful exploration of confronting those societal tensions. There's really no stone that gets left unturned, and you can't go home again. So about the halfway point, we're making progress here. There's gonna be a nice epic video here. Maybe we'll reach 50 minutes on this lecture here. Definitely gonna need a little sip. About the halfway point, George suffers ridicule and praise after his publication. So Thomas Wolfe was infamously insecure. He was notoriously very sensitive, overly sensitive to criticism, as we writers are. And he goes on these monologues about how he wants to quit writing, how, you know, he scorns and, you know, sends these abusive, hurls abuses at his, critics and his editors and his friends, anyone that's critiqued him, but then he ends up not sending any of the letters. He goes out and gets drunk and tries to deal with the frustrations that anybody feels that's a creative person once you get some honest feedback. And he's actually temporarily exiled, like he was, after he wrote Look Homeward Angel. He's kind of exiled from his hometown because he bared their faults, he bared their family problems and their insecurities for the world to see. And he's sort of struggling with feeling like a creative hack, but knowing he possesses genius. And I think that's what being a writer is. I've been working on my novel for almost 5 years now, and I'm very confident about it. But like anybody else, I see the shortcomings. I see where people might get offended. I see where people might think it's, I don't know, not advanced enough or not complex enough. But you, as a writer, you have to be willing to take on those criticisms. And Thomas Wolfe does that quite well for us. But his personality, his neurosis, is sort of this push and pull between enjoying the creative process, but oftentimes suffering the bouts of depression that come with strong criticism. Skipping a little bit ahead here, we have Wolfe's insight into the American socio-political and financial corruption. Beautiful way he's having this conversation sort of about the way about the American vision, how it's transformed from the early days of the early colonies, the early explorers, and how it's sort of gotten into the hands of these greedy, corrupt individuals. I'm not going to get into who exactly those people are, but we know who it is. It's government, it's Wall Street, it's all that good stuff. But even going back to, that's why this text is so relevant, because even going back to the early days of Thomas Wolfe, 1920s, 1930s, that was the big, age of progression, alleged progression, right? But we had the Great Depression around the early part of the century, and then there were the Roaring 20s, and then Prohibition. The big influence of the gangster squad, the mafia in New York in particular. We had feminism rising up. We had, the early stages of what would become civil rights and all that. So just a lot going on in Thomas Wolfe's America. And that's why this book is so sprawling and so fascinating, because it just like shoves you right into these conflicts of America and sociology and politics, and it's absolutely beautiful. This annotation is just a heart, because I love this section so much. Maybe we'll share a little bit of this with you here. But most of them were just floatsmen of the general ruin of the time, honest, decent, middle-aged men with faces seamed by toil and want. And young men, many of them were mere boys in their teens, with thick, unkempt hair. These were the wanderers from town to town. He's talking about the homeless people congregating in New York. They drifted across the land and gathered in the big cities when winter came, hungry, defeated, empty, hopeless, restless, driven by they know not what, always on the move, looking everywhere for work, for the bare crumbs to support their miserable lives, and finding neither work nor crumbs. So that's another stone that gets turned in Thomas Wolfe's vision in this novel, is exploring the plight of the people that are suffering beneath him. As all these bankers and all these rich people, these publishing houses and Wall Street are sort of living above on their little palaces, while the rest of the population suffers, and that's never going to change. That's just part of American society, unfortunately. But Thomas Wolfe explores that brilliantly for us in the pages of You Can't Go Home Again. This next annotation discusses the nature of man that Thomas Wolfe discusses, and he says here, "This is man, for the most part a foul, wretched, abominable creature, a packet of decay, a bundle of degenerating tissues, a creature that gets old and hairless and has foul breath, a hater of his kind, a cheater, a scorner, a mocker, and a reviler, a thing that kills and murders in a mob or in the dark, loud and full of brag, surrounded by his fellows, but without the courage of a rat alone." And he sort of discusses the introspection of his place in society among mankind, and sort of mankind as this beastly, sort of foul-natured, especially as a group. We cause so much destruction within the lives of others and the lives of nature and the lives of animals, always building cities, always wanting more, and all of it kind of goes back to the corruption of the dollar and sort of the mankind's thirst for always moving in an upward trajectory at the expense of every creature along with it. And Thomas Wolfe is not by any means a nihilist, but he's not afraid to discuss these really complex, sort of esoteric, nihilistic themes that are ingrained in American society. So the next section of the novel is called The Fox, and this part, in my opinion, went on a little bit too long. He went into the descriptions of Vauxhall Edward's personality and how he interacted with his family and his servants, but there is a highlight when Foxhall Edwards is sort of interacting with his daughter before she goes off to school one day. And he really captures, if you look up a picture of Maxwell Perkins, you can definitely see where he got the inspiration. He describes his nose and his face as the strange visage, the odd visage of some strange bird, and just the way that Maxwell Perkins kind of snoops the newspaper and snoops around his apartment and gets dressed. And just these, obviously Thomas Wolfe knew Maxwell Perkins on such a deeply beautiful emotional level that he was able to transform that and immortalize Maxwell Perkins in the pages in the Foxhall Edwards sections. Fast forwarding a little bit ahead, and not only do we get the exploration of Foxhall Edwards' personality, but sort of the way that Thomas Wolfe reveres and looks up to Maxwell Perkins, aka Foxhall Edwards, as this sort of fatherly figure. Thomas Wolfe was always looking for a fatherly figure. Fast forwarding a little bit more, we have a local unliving where this individual jumps off of one of the high rises, and Thomas Wolfe describes sort of the shock and the awe and sort of the disturbing nature of how the crowd reacts to somebody unliving themselves, and the way sort of the callous reaction, the cold, sort of stark and callous reaction to a man taking his own life in the streets of New York. Fast forwarding a little bit more, my next annotation says politics and the writer's life and desire for fame. Now that is another important aspect of You Can't Go Home Again, is George Webber's not only desire, his thirst for fame, but his reflections on how fame is sort of a double-edged sword, and how he reaps the fruits of his labor as a writer and enjoys the benefits of fame, but oftentimes he is sort of uncomfortable with his level of success. And I think that happens to many writers, or to many creative people in general. And we get this sense from George Webber that the grass is not always greener, although he really loves being respected and sort of followed around and recognized, and he gets invited to all these lavish dinners and all these dates that he is expected to appear at, but it almost becomes a distraction for a up-and-coming writer. Now, up next, we have this really quirky, interesting character. I think Thomas Wolfe is now in London. He's traveling, and he just broke with Elaine Bernstein, aka Esther Jack, and he has this really quirky maid when he's living in London named Mrs. Purvis, and she is sort of neurotic, and she's always walking into his room telling him about the scandals of the rich and the elite and of the royalty. And Thomas Wolfe kind of plays along, but he's sort of slightly irritated by her presence. But she takes care of him. She makes him really good food, and they have to decide each day what they're going to eat, so that Thomas Wolfe doesn't get sick of eating the same thing day in and day out. And I would say that the later half of this novel here, the closing part of this video, is definitely my favorite part. And McHargue is a stand-in for Sinclair Lewis. I almost forgot his name. He has this beautiful fictionalized character named McHargue, and while George Webber is in London, he meets up with McHargue. McHargue and him were previously friends. They're both successful authors, and that's why I wanted to take you through each annotation of this, so that we can cover the full expanse of this beautiful novel. And we get this sort of idea that McHargue, aka Sinclair Lewis, is not quite right. He's almost like this impish, sort of crippled, grizzled old man sort of character, but he has these strange bursts of energy, and he wants George Webber to travel with him throughout London and maybe further places. And George Webber is immersed in his novel at this time, and he escaped to Europe to sort of have more time and space to write, and he's in the middle of writing his epic novels and his prose, and he doesn't really want to hang out with McHargue, but McHargue is kind of pressuring him, and he feels kind of bad, and there's sort of this push and pull. He can't decide if he really wants to go with McHargue. Finally, he relents and decides to go on this strange exhibition, or this strange journey out in the middle of the night. George Webber really has no clue where McHargue is really taking him, and McHargue keeps falling asleep in the back of the car, and he can barely speak, and Thomas Wolfe thinks he's going to have a dead man on his hands, and the driver of the chauffeur is frightened by these two maniac writers in the back seat, and they arrive at their alleged destination in the middle of the night in London. And Thomas Wolfe has these beautiful descriptions of how creepy it was driving in the rain through these windy back roads of London. And finally they reach their destination, and Sinclair Lewis is like slumped in the back seat. He's way too exhausted. I think Sinclair Lewis maybe had narcolepsy or something to that effect, or maybe was just ill. But Thomas Wolfe says, okay, we're here now, Sinclair, can you get up and try to go to the door? And Sinclair says, no, I want you to go do it. And then so George Webber has to get out in the middle of the night and sort of walk up this strange road, and he's terrified. He doesn't know who's behind the door. But it turns out that this little creepy looking house ends up being this cozy, beautiful home where the guests are actually expecting them. But just a lot of these neurotic characters, these back and forth brilliant conversations. And a lot of this is laugh out loud hilarious. I mean, I found myself, I would read this at work sometimes and I would just be laughing because of how funny it all was. Just these really quirky, neurotic conversations and just oddball characters. And they have this beautiful dinner and breakfast, and they're all drinking wine and like dark beer at this cozy house. And Thomas Wolfe is satiated, and similar to what George Webber did in The Web and the Rock, he's still trying to swallow the world, and he's trying to experience every single thing, oftentimes to the detriment of his own creative process or his own personality. And we get this back and forth and sort of these arguments because McCarg, aka Sinclair Lewis, is always in a rush. He always wants to get somewhere, but he just doesn't have the vitality. He's always falling asleep. He's always kind of neurotically, but then he, like I said, he gets these rushes of energy, and Thomas Wolfe or George Webber rather, is just kind of taken aback. So this last section of the novel, Thomas Wolfe, he's had his fill of London and of Europe. He's had his fill of London, so he travels to Germany, and very similar to The Web and the Rock, George Webber loves Germany. It's in real life, Thomas Wolfe really is, Germany was one of his favorite places to vacation, and he felt that it had sort of this ancient calmness to it, and he felt one with the people, and the people loved his writing, and I'm not sure if they still do. But this was prior, obviously, to Tiny Mustache Man, I guess we'll call him, and the Third Reich and all that. But Thomas Wolfe starts to notice this sickness, this paranoia, this neurosis that is occurring in German society at this time. And he's sort of in Germany, and he's sort of contemplating meeting up. He's contemplating whether he wants to leave, but he ends up getting kind of delayed by this other character called Halaig, and this man talks in a very, very heavy German accent. And he's sort of describing for George Webber what he's seen, and that he believes that the Gestapo, the Third Reich, might actually be spying on him. They might be trying to sabotage him because he does have some Jewishness in his heritage, I believe. So people have started to disappear in this German society, and it's just a fascinating but chilling exploration of how slowly the authoritative rule of Tiny Mustache Man sort of gained so much power, and sort of the backdoor dealings and the criminal activities that were taking place in order for Tiny Mustache Man to sort of corrupt society to that level. Now, obviously, there's a lot of different arguments, for or against Tiny Mustache Man. We're not going to cover that in this video, but obviously, a lot of people had to suffer, in this German society because of what Tiny Mustache Man was doing. And he has these beautiful descriptions and he meets this other woman. She's sort of like this tall German, sort of Valkyrie-esque type, beautiful blonde, buxom woman. He has a relationship with her. And this annotation is hearted as well. And he goes on this train ride. He's further exploring Germany. He's meeting up, I think, with his last friend that he knows in Germany. And there is a strange man in a compartment that happens to be with George Webber. And basically this woman, a son and his mother show up, and they're a little bit odd, but George Webber starts conversing with them. But there's this strange old codger type man, sort of this old cranky old man, and the other boarders in the train traveling through Germany can't quite figure out what's up this dude's rear end. And as we get further along the text, he sort of breaks, this odd codger type man, this old geezer sort of breaks out of his shell, but he's kind of neurotically, checking his bags. He's neurotically walking up and down the aisles of the train, almost in this paranoid state. And then Thomas Wolfe gets out and has lunch with his friend, and when they come back, they see the police officials, the government officials are surrounding their room in the train and at the train station, and it turns out that this man has in fact been captured by the Third Reich, by Tiny Mustache Man, and Thomas Wolfe can do nothing because Thomas Wolfe or George Weber actually was collaborating with this man. They actually loaned him some money to help the other people that were in his cabin in the train, because basically they were in Germany and they were getting close to the border, and they needed to transfer their money over and their tickets over to sort of get the updated form of currency wherever it was they were going. And they actually lent this man some money or something, but it turns out this man was pretty wealthy, and somehow the Tiny Mustache officials got wind that he was trying to flee the country, obviously for obviously specific reasons, because he was living in fear. He was a Jewish banker, and he was trying to flee the country. And Thomas Wolfe describes for us how as Thomas Wolfe is awaiting the next train, how he sees this man desperately pleading with the authorities, and as they sort of shackle him and take him off, Thomas Wolfe is left on the side of the train station, just looking at this man that he was beginning to become friends with, and he just remained silent because they were all afraid. The other boarders in the cabin in the train were afraid that they were going to be also implemented in this crime and maybe captured by Tiny Mustache Man. So that really is the tragedy of well, there's actually two tragedies of You Can't Go Home Again. The narrative tragedy is this ending section where this man is captured by the Third Reich. It's this heartbreaking narrative of what was happening in German society at this time. But the real tragedy of You Can't Go Home Again is that it was Thomas Wolfe's last work. We don't get anything after this except for the hills beyond, and it's a tragedy that Thomas Wolfe did not live longer, because he was really becoming one of the best writers that America ever saw, and he was really coming out of his shell both thematically and emotionally and literature wise. He was really covering the entire panorama of not only American society, where his upbringing and his roots were, but also critiquing this larger expanse of foreign endeavors and foreign conflicts and foreign policy that was obviously affecting the entire world. And also, my last couple of annotations here says the passage of time, reality, injustice, corruption, and disenchantment. And similar to his earlier passage about sort of the beastly mob of mankind, Thomas Wolfe goes on this I don't want to say political rant, but he's very disillusioned by sort of the powers that he once thought were all consuming and all powerful. And even though he's benefited from the fruits of his labor, and he's benefited from being sort of an upper class writer, or sort of but he does have working class roots, obviously, with his history with the Joiners, and being part of their clan in sort of rural America. He sees sort of the constant struggle of humanity, and that humanity can never fully be cured of its evils, especially when money and politics come into play. But I will say that hopefully this video has inspired you to read You Can't Go Home Again, as well as The Web and the Rock. And like I said previously in this video, I think Thomas Wolfe does something really powerful in his posthumous works, even if they were highly compromised or edited by Edward Aswell and some of the folks over there at the publishing house. But please leave your thoughts and comments. Have you read You Can't Go Home Again? What do you think about the George Weber saga versus the Eugene Gant saga? Make sure you guys like, share, and subscribe to this video. And please check out the Thomas Wolfe playlist if you want to see more Thomas Wolfe content, to get your socks off about Thomas Wolfe. So we will see everybody in the next video. Thank you so much for watching, and for listening